Melkite. Yeah, you got it.
Okay. All right. Shalom, everybody. This is Rabbi Gav, and how do you want to introduce yourself?
Call me CF.
CS?
CF.
CF.
Yeah.
So we're doing a little bit of a collaboration today. Let me get out of Facebook here so we don't get that annoying notification buzz every time. A video was posted. It was actually sent to me by the Holy Language Institute YouTube channel. It's a Messianic YouTube channel. These are people who are, in some ways, nebulously or nominally Jewish, but who are basically more or less practicing Baptists. A claim is made in the title of a video, and I'm going to post the link to the video in this video response we're doing. So here's the video title. In 30 AD, the Sanhedrin was exiled and stopped judging capital cases. Why? Question mark. The implication being that after the Sanhedrin executed Jesus of Nazareth, they were exiled from the city of Jerusalem and they stopped judging capital cases. Anyone familiar with Jewish literature, with secular history, or even the Christian New Testament knows that this is patent nonsense. And that the creator of this content used some pretty underhanded and dishonest techniques to try and make this claim. Going much beyond that, CF here is going to kind of give you a rundown on why this is incorrect from a traditional Christian perspective. Go ahead.
Well, all right. So, for example, we actually have certain passages where the Sanhedrin themselves actually seem to presuppose heavily that they have the power to kill people. So here are
this would be after the death of Jesus, yes?
This would be after the death of Jesus, but before 70 AD with the collapse of Jerusalem.
Okay. Continue.
All right. So you see, you have a few cases. Like one is the stoning of Stephen. Stephen actually says, however, the Most High Day does not live in houses made by human hands, as the prophet says. Heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord? Or where will my resting place be? Has not my hand made for all things, you stiff-necked people? Your hearts and ears are still uncircumcised. You are just like your ancestors. You always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? And they even killed those who predicted the coming of the righteous one, and now you have betrayed and murdered him. You have received the law that was given through angels and have not obeyed it. When the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him, but Stephen was full of the Holy Spirit, looked to heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand. And they covered their ears, yelling at the top of their voices. They rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, and began to stone him. Notice in this passage, within Acts chapter 7, there was actually no trial. They just stoned him, took him off, and killed him. At least not in an official capacity. And this wasn't, and notice at this part, they didn't need to finish up a trial. They just took him out there. Like, once someone says something of blasphemy, like, there's no need to levy accusations. It's what's done is done. Another passage that they might use is in John, where when one of the Jews says to Pilate, yeah, it's against our law to kill people, and thus we need Roman law to do so. First off, the New Testament doesn't require the bad guys of their narratives to be particularly honest. Secondarily, even if he was honest, as long as there was one dissenting vote in the Sanhedrin, from what I recall in Jewish law, that's enough where you can't go through with the killing. Am I wrong about that?
I'm sorry, you cut out for just a second.
Oh, I was asking you, if there's one dissenting vote in the Sanhedrin for killing somebody, you can't go through with the capital punishment. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. You can't be unanimous. They can't all be for killing them. It has to be a majority, but less than unanimous.
Oh, okay. I guess Josephus could have been the one vote, but in any case, the New Testament doesn't require its villains in the narrative to be exceptionally honest. So there's that. So it's not necessary for the New Testament to be infallible or inerrant. And all right, and also with the apostles, Gamaliel in chapter 5 of Acts actually says, as his argument for why they shouldn't kill the apostles and the followers of Jesus, if they're of God, then there's no use in opposing them, and if they're of man, then the Romans are just going to take care of them. That's a prudential response. It's not supposed to be an in principle response. So the New Testament itself refutes this point.
Very good. One thing I'm going to bring here from Josephus from secular history. Josephus was the Roman Jewish historian of the first century, and he talks about in his book, his book Antiquities of the Jews, book 20, chapter 9, about the death of James, the brother of Jesus. And now Caesar, upon hearing the death of Festus, sent Albinus into Judea as procurator. But the king deprived Joseph of the high priesthood and bestowed the succession to that dignity on the son of Ananus, who was also himself called Ananus. And now the report goes that this eldest Ananus proved a most fortunate man, for he had 5 sons who had all performed the office of a high priest to God, and who had himself enjoyed that dignity a long time formerly, which had never happened to any other of our high priests. But this younger Ananus, who, as we have told you already, took the high priesthood, was a bold man in his temper and very insolent. He was also of the sect of the Sadducees, who are very rigid in judging offenders. Above all the rest of the Jews, as we have already observed, when therefore Ananus was of this disposition, he thought he had now proper opportunity. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. So here we have in the year 62, obviously 32 years after the year 30, there's still a Sanhedrin that stones people. So that's our little bit from secular history. I can go through more of Josephus and find other examples, but that's a pretty pertinent one as it relates directly to Jesus's family. And I kind of want to address a little bit the claims made in the video itself. At around 1201, you'll see a freeze frame here, and this is what it says here. 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the Sanhedrin was exiled and took up residence in Hanut. Rabbi Isaac ben Avdimi said, "This is to teach that they did not try cases of fines." Cases of fines, can you really think so? Say rather, they did not try capital cases. And the very first reference he gives is Sanhedrin 41a. I just kind of want to mention here that this series, this playlist on this guy's YouTube channel, is about the Mishnah, which is the oral law, basically. Yet none of his proof texts that he cites here come from the Mishnah. They come from the Gemara, from the actual completed Talmud, which was completed years later. And if anyone actually wanted to check his claim and see what Sanhedrin 41a, the very first one, actually says, which I can do here right now. Come on. One second here. Okay, Sanhedrin 41a. The Gemara continues its question, and it is taught in a Bereta. 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sanhedrin was exiled from the chamber of hewn stone and sat in the store near the Temple Mount. And Rabbi Yitzhak bar of Avudimi says, the intent of the statement concerning the relocation of the Sanhedrin is to say they no longer judged laws of fines. The Gemara asks, does it enter your mind to say that they no longer judged laws of fines? It is known that the Sanhedrin would judge laws of fines for hundreds of years after the destruction of the temple. Rather, he must have said that the Sanhedrin no longer judged cases of capital law. Once the Sanhedrin left the chamber of hewn stone, the court's power to judge capital cases was nullified. Now, it's very interesting as it says very clearly that this is taught from a Bereta. What is a Bereta? A Bereta is a non-authoritative, non-binding teaching from the early Mishnaic period that didn't actually make it into the Mishnah. So this is a non-literal, non-binding tradition that he's relying on to make an absolute claim, which we know from other sources like Josephus, other parts of the Talmud, and even the New Testament is patently false. And he makes no mention of this in his video that this comes from a Baraita, that it comes from not only outside the Mishnah, it comes also from outside the Talmud. It comes from a tertiary source. Again, that isn't binding. It basically repeats the same thing in Shabbat 15a. And Avodah Zarah 8b, it doesn't mention anything about capital cases. It mentions the first point about judging fines and being relocated. It doesn't mention anything about no longer judging capital cases. Furthermore, we have proof in the time of Rabbi Yehoshua ben Parachia, the end, this had been the mid to late 2nd century. He oversaw a Sanhedrin that put other men to death, including another Jesus, a Jesus, the son of Stada, for sorcery. So obviously, if he's going to quote the Talmud as proof that the Sanhedrin stopped doing executions and judging capital cases in 30 of the Common Era, certainly he has to take into account the other passages in the Talmud that say otherwise. But I doubt that there's any intent on his part to be intellectually honest here.
Yeah. I'm not sure why he even needed this to be true, though. Does he go into the video?
Not really. He kind of takes it. There are other videos that have a similar kind of dumb claim to it. It's not. He has a whole playlist called "Teachings from the Mishnah," which is kind of interesting from a messianic Christian perspective that they would give that very much weight. But he acknowledges that Jesus seems to support many teachings in the Mishnah, and while that's true, the Mishnah wasn't actually put into pen and paper form until the year 200. So.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing if they can't really get something such as this straight, there's really little reason to take them seriously when it comes to, well, other things theological.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. Although I did want to speak about something. Is there a difference? Are there any restrictions, though, in capital punishments within Judaism? Because at least from one website, which is just called My Jewish Learning, and I presume it's a basic intro site for people just learning about Judaism. There's a Mishnah that states a religious court that executes someone more than once in 7 years was considered destructive. Is it like, even though there are a lot of reasons, even though in principle someone could be put to death in a Jewish court, in practice, how often would it have been carried out?
Well, that's a matter of interpretation. So you'll see what you just quoted, that, and there's some opinion, some say it's 7 years, some say it's every 70 years. If the court put to death more than one person in, say, 7 years, or it was a bloody court, or but it finishes off that little passage with, but like, if we never put anybody to death, then Israel will be rife with murder.
I like that.
I mean, the end of the passage does seem to be fairly pro capital punishment in that regard. The system is set up in a way that the only people who are put to death are those for which the evidence is overwhelming and every procedural check is followed. For example, it has to be seen by 2 witnesses. The 2 witnesses have to be of moral character. They can't be related to each other. Things like that. If the Sanhedrin is too convinced, is absolutely, oh yeah, and every single person votes yes, they throw it out, because there's no reason for this to be unanimous. There should be one person saying no, at least. There are a number of different things that have to be met before someone can be put to death, and it would be very difficult. So whatever you did to incur the death penalty had to be very public, and there had to be warnings, usually under most circumstances, that what you were doing could incur the death penalty, and you would have had to choose to do it anyway, basically. So I don't think it was as common as many people think, but I also don't think it was once every 70 years either. pretty sure people who stabbed someone in the market is probably going to get it. You know.
And was there a difference between, at least for the charge of apostasy, the Sanhedrin judging through trial and putting someone to death, and a public pronouncement and just stoning?
For like blasphemy and idolatry, yes. For like apostasy, it's a little bit less clear. We know that at least one Talmudic sage was an apostate,
Hmm.
Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya, but he was never put to death for it. So it's not what is considered apostasy in the Talmudic literature is not clearly defined. So I don't think that's something that very often incurred the death penalty, if at all.
So if someone like Stephen was to say, like point blank, yeah, the Sanhedrin is terrible. You've put to death prophets. You're putting to death Christ. Like, you don't even need to finish the trial at that point. You could just take him out and stone him. Like, at least by the law.
Yeah, well, I mean, so it's Hilchot Mamrim. It's the
Hmm.
laws pertaining to a rebellious one, someone who rebels against the authority of the court, which he seems to be very publicly and very clearly doing in that passage. So that actually makes perfect sense. That fits with what we know.
Oh, all right then. And And there was no reason why I think maybe he needs it to be true because in principle there should be some reason why the Sanhedrin didn't just put Jesus to death themselves rather than just pass the buck to the Roman authorities. Like that would probably be my guess.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah. I mean, well, it's pretty clear that the Romans gave pretty broad latitude to the Sanhedrin to kind of do things what they well, but it was considered something that was also a crime against the empire. The Romans may also handle it. They may turn over someone to the Romans, that type of thing. So it's not necessarily a contradiction.
Exactly, and the Sanhedrin could have refused to do so, not out of principle, but out of prudence. I mean, at least as he's portrayed in the New Testament, Jesus does seem to have enough followers that if the Sanhedrin was to put him to death, they would suffer some sort of public backlash.
Yeah, it's basically like, okay, we really don't like this guy, but we really don't need public riots right now.
Let's just pass the buck to the Romans on this one.
Yeah, basically. Which
Yeah,
man, it's it's the thinking at the time would have probably been it'll probably be just as bad if the Romans do it, but at least it won't fall on us. So
exactly. And Pilate himself didn't seem to want to do it. He wanted to, well, wash his hands of it.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, and oh, actually, another question I would have had is if the Sanhedrin was to directly do it themselves, would they have to use by the means of stoning, or could they themselves have used crucifixion?
Well, I mean, for the specific charge involved with the case of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospels, it's probably for sedition, for plotting against the state, which is what crucifixion was normally meted out for. Um, yeah, it's not really. I mean, in Jewish law, there's four ways you can be put to death: stoning, strangling, burning. Um, what's the other one? Beheading, maybe.
Yeah, and to be fair, if I had to choose between those four and crucifixion, I would definitely go with the crucifixion. So another possibility is if they were going to put him to death, they might have just passed the buck to the Romans because it was far more excruciating than the law would have allowed.
Yeah, well, I mean, the law also stipulates that you be given an intoxicating drug so you don't feel anything.
Yeah, yeah, that would have also made crucifixion all the easier.
Yeah. Yep.
Mm. Okay, I don't think there's anything else to cover. So this has been a really nice refutation. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We'll do it again sometime.
Awesome. Oh, and could I just say something for the Messianics?
Sure.
If you guys do want to, like emphasize some of the more Jewish aspects of Christianity, you could always just come to the Catholic Church. We actually have kept a lot of the things. For example, we actually still have the same robes and outfits that try to mimic a lot of what the priests in the Old Testament had. We actually do offer some kind of real sacrifice, although it's the Eucharist as opposed to the specific animals of the Old Testament. It's more akin to the sacrifice that Melchizedek made of wine and bread. And furthermore, if you go to some of the Melkite parishes, like the Melkite Catholic ones and other Eastern Catholic parishes, we still use Aramaic and other ancient terms as well. So you don't have to be Baptist with yarmulkes, just saying.
Fair enough. I don't think I can improve upon that. Okay, gonna go ahead and wrap up the live broadcast now.
Cool,
Thanks for
cool.
watching, everybody.